This is episode number 210 featuring British artist James Willis, and you're about to learn a lot about painting architecture and buildings.
This is the PleinAir Podcast with Eric Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. In the PleinAir Podcast, we cover the world of outdoor painting. Called PleinAir, the French coined the term, which means open air or outdoors. The French pronounce it plein air. Others say plain air. No matter how you say it, there is a huge movement of artists around the world who are going outdoors to paint. And this show is about that movement. Now, here's your host, author, publisher, and painter, Eric Rhoads.
Thank you, Jim Kipping, and welcome everybody to the PleinAir Podcast. And thank you again. PleinAir Podcast has been rated number one in Feedspot's 2021 Top 15 Painting Podcast list. Number one. That's pretty cool. We love that. If you're a regular, I took a break. I've been away. I have not done the podcast for a few weeks, and I normally have been very religious about getting it out there all the time, but I took a break. Actually, I started out to take a 2-week vacation, and I ended up staying a month, and I just never have done anything like that before, but it was time. You know, after a year of daily broadcast during COVID, I started to burn out. I got to admit it. As a matter of fact, last week's Sunday Coffee, I wrote all about that whole burnout and what I learned from it. You can find out more about that at coffeewitheric.com. But anyway, I'm back and I'm excited and I'm refreshed and feeling good about things. And I'm about to do some painting. Now, I want to tell you, I was in a motorhome. And we took the motorhome, we drove it all the way to Florida from here, and we stayed in a motorhome park. And, you know, it's kind of fun. It's something I hadn't really experienced before. And when I was down there, I visited family, of course, socially distancing, of course. Don't get on me on that. And I met with my niece, who has an acupuncture studio called Roads to Health in Jupiter, Florida. And I went into her office and asked her to do an acupuncture treatment, and I saw this big blank wall. And you know how we think, right? We see a blank wall. What do we think? Yeah. I said, what are you going to put on that wall? She says, no, I really need a painting. And she said, would you do one for me? I, of course, knew she'd ask. And I said, sure. So I went out and I bought a big 30 by 40 canvas. And you can't paint indoors in a RV, and a 30 by 40 is a pretty big one. And so I did this giant plein air painting, a 30 by 40. It took me several sessions, probably 30, 40 hours, maybe not so much, maybe 30 hours. And I just did this big painting. And then I had to have it some drying time and stuff, and I gave it to her. So she was nuts about it, thankfully. Hopefully, maybe she's telling me she likes it and she doesn't really. But anyway, it was a lot of fun. So I actually set up, I have a new easel I've been experimenting with, which is called an PleinAir Pro. And it's got a really big surface, and I needed a big surface for painting a big painting. And even though it really wasn't configured for a big painting like that, I made it work with some bungee cords. And so that's going to be kind of fun to reminisce about, because it's about the only painting I did on my vacation. I did do some watercolors because of Watercolor Live. I learned more about watercolor, and I really knocked a couple of them out of the park. Really proud of them. I sat on the beach and did watercolor because I didn't want to sit at the beach with my oils because I was with family. So anyway, that was kind of cool. Here in Texas, the bluebonnets are out, and the bluebonnets are crazy. I saw seas of blue flowers. I mean, fields and fields filled with blue flowers as I was coming in. And now they're starting to get to full, what would be the word? Full bloom. You know, they're really looking nice. And so I'm going to go out this week or this weekend and paint them before they go away, because they don't last long. And they're really a challenge because, you know, you got the blues against the greens and you want to make it believable, and you put all that blue in a yard and it doesn't look believable. And, you know, there's that fine line between, you know, rendering the, you know, every blue bonnet and making it feel like blue bonnets, and also making it impressionistic. So it's a challenge. Bring it on. I like that. And It's a good way for me to test myself and to, try to get myself to the next level. I'm constantly trying to do that, which is why I'm excited about PleinAir Live. If you haven't heard of it, I really highly recommend that you check it out. It's really a cool thing. It's like our convention, the PleinAir convention, except it's more people and more people around the world. And there's a lot of things we can do online that we can't do at the convention and vice versa. And we had to cancel our convention this year because of COVID, again, second year in a row. So we really need the help anyway. So it'd be really great if you would go to it, but only if it's going to be good for you. It's a virtual art conference, and it's 3 full days of teaching. Plus, there's a beginner's day for those people who want to sign up only for the beginner's day if you want to. And it's the top plein air painters and landscape artists in the world who are teaching. And the lineup is absolutely stellar. I would say we have 2 of the 3 most important and most well-known plein air painters on earth who are participating this year. And so, and there's many, many, many more of the very, very top. And so just go check it out. Go to pleinairlive.com. Now, remember, the price has to keep going up because of the way we have to book things and we have to plan. But the price is going to go up again soon. So just go there and check it out. And by the way, you won't regret it. You will have a great time. You'll learn a lot. If you can't make the dates, you can still get the replays. And it's just going to transform you. I guarantee you, if you're new, if you're a beginner, don't tell yourself you don't deserve to go. I mean, you do deserve, and you're going to learn a lot, and you should do the beginner day and then maybe do the rest of it if you want to. I highly recommend that, of course. And then also, if you're experienced, even experienced pros, I mean, you're going to learn so much. The last time we did this, I had people who are, iconic names that you would know who said to me, I attended. I didn't know if I was going to learn anything, but I learned a lot, and I learned things from a lot of different people. Everybody had something to teach me. So check it out. It's called PleinAir Live, and it's at pleinairlive.com. We've got viewers from over, I think, about 28 or 30 countries, instructors from several countries who will never probably be able to come and in person. And also you have people, coming who just can't possibly make the trip. And you don't have to spend the money that you normally have to spend on hotel and rental cars and airfare and all that stuff, plus the convention. And so this way, I mean, anybody in the world can attend, and it's a very reasonable price. So check it out. It's pleinairlive.com. And remember, Beginner's Day is April 14th. You can save $300 on registration if you register before April 11th, so it's just around the corner. We also have done these new workshops called SOAR, and SOAR is stands for Streamline Online Artist Revitalization. And what we wanted to do is to take Zoom workshops and put them on steroids, and using teaching technology, which we've really dug into deeply and studied. And people who did the last SOAR workshop with Bill Davidson just had raving reviews. We've got another one coming up with Thomas Schaller, the great watercolorist, in May 12th through 15th. So check that out at soarworkshops.com. And of course, last but not least, my Adirondack event is going to take place this year. We're pretty sure. We had to cancel it last year, unfortunately. So this year will be the 10-year anniversary. We got some really cool things planned. And it's going to be in the Adirondacks the 12th through 19th of June. You can be safe. You can paint outdoors with us. We all dine together. We'll have social distancing and everything that we need to do. If you need to, a lot of you are vaccinated. And so it's things are starting to get back to normal. And so we're doing Paint the Adirondacks, the Publishers Invitational in June. We're going to do a fall event in the Adirondacks this year for the first time. So it's going to be pretty spectacular. So go to publishersinvitational.com to learn all about those. We are celebrating the 10-year anniversary of PleinAir Magazine, and the new issue is available now, and we continue to celebrate in the April-May edition. Editor Kelly Kane is going to be sharing a timeline of PleinAir through the decades, which you don't want to miss. And you can, of course, preview a little of that issue in this week's PleinAir Today newsletter. Coming up after the interview, which is going to be killer, I'll be answering some art marketing questions in the Art Marketing Minute. But let's get right to our interview with UK artist James Willis. James Willis, welcome to the PleinAir Podcast.
Thank you, Eric, and hello. Hi.
And hello. We got to know each other when you came over to the PleinAir convention. I can't remember what year it was, but that's when we really got connected and became friends. We kind of got acquainted a little bit. We were introduced because of Rosemary Brushes, who suggested you as a faculty member. And we've been in touch and contact since that time.
We have. It seems such a long time ago now, Eric, doesn't it? But that was in Tucson, and it was a really wonderful experience for me. Great to meet you and many other new friends who I'm still in touch with from that time. So it's been wonderful.
I think that you were kind of given a bath of fire because we did a skit when we first met you. I think we said, "Hey, you want to be in a skit?" And we did the opening skit, which was a cowboy scene, and you got to be a part of that. That was kind of fun.
That's right. I've never been a cowboy before, so that was great. Yeah.
Yeah. So James, tell everybody where you are, where you live, and because I haven't really touched on that, they can probably guess from your accent.
Sure. Well, I'm James. I live just north of London in the UK, in a small market town called Hitchin, which is a beautiful, I suppose you would call it quaint town. It has buildings going back to the 11th century and even before that, and has an amazing collection of historic architecture on a small scale. And it is a wonderful place because within 10 minutes from anywhere in the town, really, you can walk into open rural countryside as well, the English countryside. So I'm really lucky for ideas for painting living here because I can do architecture, I can do landscape, and all on the doorstep, literally. So it's a beautiful place, and it's in a county called Hertfordshire, which stretches sort of from north of London up towards Cambridge, the university city of Cambridge. So beautifully placed town in England.
Well, you have kind of packaged yourself as an architecture painter, although you do a lot of landscape from what I understand as well. You taught landscape at the PleinAir convention. Where did this passion for architecture happen?
That's a really interesting question. I've often asked myself this. I think it's partly living in this beautiful town. There's always wonderful architecture around. And also, when I was very young, I had a electric train set, and I used to love making the buildings, little cities for the train set. So I'm sure it partly came from working in 3 dimensions and creating my own architecture, if you like. And I've always sort of painted, but not necessarily architecture. You're quite right. I paint a lot of landscape as well. And about 20 years ago, I was very privileged to be invited to work at the Sir John Soane's Museum in London, which I think you visited, Eric, when you were over here a few years ago.
I did, yes.
And that is an architectural museum. It's the home of a Georgian architect, John Soane, who built the Bank of England and various other public buildings in England. And just working in that extraordinary historic collection, looking at drawings from all periods up to the middle of the 19th century, architectural works, inspired me even more to look at architecture. So that's really, I think, where the main thrust of my interest in architecture came from. And as you know, I lecture in art history and architecture as well. So all of this sort of knowledge transfers into the painting as well. So I have a real passion for it, not just in the UK, but when I travel as well.
Well, I want to get a little of that lecture in on this podcast. Maybe we can talk about some of those historic items and art history and so on. But first, what I'd like to do, I also should mention that I'm going to ask you, put you on the spot a little bit later. I'm going to ask you to kind of give us some ideas and tips on painting architecture. I know I struggle with it.
Okay.
So we'll get into that. But how did this whole art journey begin for you?
The art journey. Well, I'm very lucky. My mother's a very creative woman, and I remember being given my first oil paints around the age of 9, which sort of complemented on our television at the time the wonderful Nancy Kaminsky, which you may remember her paint-along programs. And I was sort of transfixed by those wonderful time lapses of her paintings at the end, which sort of all appeared as if by magic. And I'm sure that's where my interest in the sort of physicality of painting came from. And we're always encouraged to paint and be creative. So it came from a very early age, and I can't honestly remember a time when I wasn't painting or making something. So I don't see it as a discrete thing. I think it is part of a wider picture of information, of knowledge, and practical using materials in paint and in 3 dimensions. So it kind of all rolls up together for me.
Well, before this podcast, I was doing an interview with Virgil Elliott, who has written a very important book on painting. And one of the things that he talked about is that those who are fortunate enough to become passionate about and start learning art at a very young age have such an advantage. He equated it to being able to learn a language. When you grow up in a 2-language household, it just happens so naturally. Is that kind of what happened to you? I mean, it just kind of came naturally, or did you get a lot of formal training? What was your story?
A lot of it is self-learned to begin with, because, I mean, obviously you learn at high school, I think you call it, a little art, but a lot of it is just doing it, I think, and being interested in making marks, in exploring textures on paper or canvas. But I did decide that I would do a degree in painting when I graduated from high school. So I went to university in Chester, which is in the north of England, a beautiful medieval town. And I specialised there not in painting, interestingly, but in printmaking, etching and intaglio printmaking. So that's more about drawing, Eric. And the idea of architecture really, for me, is connected with that process of drawing and making prints. When I graduated from fine arts, I did music as well. I'm a pianist, as we think you know. So I did two kind of subjects. The art didn't really stick at that time. And in fact, I went into finance for several years after I graduated. I sort of got a proper job, as many people are forced to do. And one day, there was a sort of light bulb moment when I, on the way to work, decided that I couldn't do this much longer and wanted to really push the painting and creating and making beautiful things, and experiencing the world through art. So I went in to my boss and said, I'm leaving now, goodbye, and went. And that was it. That was the transforming moment. And ever since, I've worked, as a freelance painter and art historian. So everything sort of crystallized at that moment. And I did some further study, and I've just kept painting ever since. So it's been a really interesting evolution from childhood and having a pause really in finance, and then going for it after that. So that was really the direction I wanted to go in, and I've kept going ever since.
So what was the struggle in terms of, or was it a struggle in terms of saying, all right, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to make my living as an artist? I mean, that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it wasn't. I think it was more of a mind thing. I knew I couldn't carry on in accounting. That was just deadly boring for me. So I just pushed it. I started teaching as in a freelance way. I exhibited. I sold little pieces from my parents' garage initially, and just let it grow rather organically, Eric, to be honest. And I've been so fortunate in projects that have come along, not necessarily just for painting, but work, like I mentioned, at Sir John Soames Museum, just fitted in at the right time. So it's a very rich existence because it pulls in from all sorts of areas, and the painting's been the consistent strand throughout that.
Your parents must have been mortified, right? So here's this kid who likes art. He's got a good accounting job, and all of a sudden he's going to try to sell art. Must have been quite a conversation.
It was, and I think it was such an alien experience for my father particularly, not quite getting how it could work, but he fortunately saw it develop very well. He passed away a few years ago, but just before that, I had my first major London show. So he saw, where it had ended up, and these big architectural pieces of London he was able to see at that time. So that was a really nice thing to know that he could be confident, that you'd made a good show of it.
Well, getting a show,
but it is a shock, I'm sure.
Getting a show in London, New York, or London is no difficult feat. I mean, it's no easy task. You've had several major shows. You've got another big one coming up. When is that? Tell us about that show.
Yes, I have, Eric. Thank you. There's one coming up next year. It's just the germ of an exhibition at the moment, but I'm very fortunate that I know the American architectural painter Carl Lorbin, who's a great friend of mine, and we met a few years ago, despite the fact that he lives 10 doors around the corner in my street. We'd never met, and a mutual friend said, "Have you ever met Carl?" I said, "No, I'd love to meet him." And he said the same to my friend. So we met. We became really good friends. And we're having a joint show of architectural work next year in the town centre here in Hitchin, in our new museum gallery. So very excited about that. It's a lot of work to get done, but really looking forward to that. So, wonderful experience. Again, everything sort of slots into place when the time is right, I believe.
And you also have, I think you said you had a new book coming out. Is that right?
I have, yes, Eric. It's stuck in the Suez Canal at the moment, so it will be here one day.
So we're recording this. We're recording this right at the time when the ship has just been released from the Suez Canal, and then so it was probably on one of the other ships that is waiting to get through.
I hope it was on one of the other ones. Yes. Maybe they threw it overboard to float the ship off. I don't know. But no, a wonderful book project. I was commissioned 2 years ago to make a book, illustrate and write the text of a book called Painting Buildings in Oils, as I'm mostly known for architecture. And it was a big project, and it was sort of dwindling a bit because I've been so busy at the beginning of last year. And in March, about this time last year, we all got locked down in the UK for several months. And that was all I had to do because I couldn't do my live classes. We weren't allowed to go out the house. So I just hunkered down and started finishing off the book. So I had 3 months really consolidated time painting and illustrating the book and then writing it. And yes, I'm really pleased. It's a beautiful looking book and it comes out next month. So very excited about that.
Oh, congratulations. So
book.
It's an instructional book and a how-to book. Is that right?
Yes, sort of. It has some step-by-step examples. It also has a sort of more inspirational slant. So not necessarily how to do it, but more how to approach painting architecture, what to look for, how to get a sense of the structure of the form, different methods of representing it. And also there's a chapter on the history of architectural painting as well. So it's kind of a bit of everything, Eric, aimed at beginners and experienced painters. And Carl has very graciously allowed me to put some of his work in it as well. So it's got some really wonderful illustrations. And some of your friends from the States, Jane Hunt and Dave Santianis, have also contributed work to it. So
fabulous. Really
privileged to have their work in as well.
Yeah, both very good painters. So let's talk about some of these techniques because I go out, this is not about me, but I go out and I struggle with architecture and I notice a lot of people do. And I think it starts with placement. And maybe there's something before that, but the thing I see some people tend to do is they either make the architecture too far distant or too close. Talk to us about composition when it comes to painting buildings or houses or any kind of architecture.
Sure, Eric. Yeah, I think that's a very common thing. I'm not doing it myself. If you suddenly think it doesn't fit on the page or on the canvas. I always plan in a sketch or a drawing before I hit the paper for watercolor or a canvas for oils, even if it's just for 10 minutes, stop and really look at the shapes, the volume of the building, the geometry of the building, and make some kind of sketch so you can find a way of placing it in a surface, on a surface. Also, I think we have an inclination to get everything in, and sometimes that's not needed. Just think, why am I picking this particular building for my subject, and which bits of it are important I want to convey? And you may find that the small doorway and part of the wall is all that you want to paint in, and then you can use those elements to make a composition. And you need some foreground, even if it's just a bit of street in front of the building, and possibly something behind it, but not necessarily. And that relationship of the size of the building to the foreground is really important. If the foreground's too big, then of course the building will be much smaller, and you'll end up with lots of sort of far distant buildings, as you say. If you want something more visible and slightly more abstracted, then just take a section of the building and make that a kind of dominant part of your surface that you're working on.
Now, do you have any particular sort of rules of composition in terms of where you place things, where you've got the foreground, you've got the building, but a lot of artists are using a golden mean or a tic-tac-toe board, and
sure.
Kind of the intersections. Do you have anything that particularly tends to lend itself well to architecture?
Sure. I think there's two things to consider before you get there. First of all, are you doing a sort of elevation, a flat view of a building, or are you trying to get a sense of distance and perspective within the composition? The elevation can be placed more or less anywhere on a surface with elements, as I say, of foreground and maybe sky above it. If you're looking for a composition with a building of interest,
right,
I think take it to be maybe 2/3 of the surface with an oblique perspective view running one side of it or the other. So you have a sort of front view for 2/3 and a side view going into perspective maybe for 1/3. So you use the golden ratio that way, or reverse that and have 1/3 of the front of the building, say, flat towards you, and then a perspective view to the side leading off into the distance for, say, 2/3. But within that structure, I think there are important things to consider. It might be the roof line of the building and its surroundings is one of the most interesting shapes in your view, and that should be placed maybe 1/3 of the way down the canvas, so you have the lovely shape of the buildings against the sky, and then work downwards from there within that proportion. So the golden section, the golden mean, is a really useful framework at intersections in architecture. Yes, you're quite right. But you can turn that on its head, of course, and just have a thin strip of empty space to one side and have or maybe 4/5 of the canvas as a building. I think it's finding the character of the building really that's important to me.
I remember a book that you gave me of probably from a show of paintings that you did of the skyscrapers in London, and
yes.
And you. The tendency for many of us is to want to put in every window and every sense of that, every element of that building. But what I noticed is that yours read as if you had done that, but you hadn't done that. Tell us a little bit more about how you accomplished that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, someone else was talking to me about one of those paintings from that book not very long ago, and they said, what's really interesting in the way you work is you're working in an abstract sense and a realism with detail. And I think that is how I approach a painting, particularly architecture. I look at the abstract forms, the geometric shapes, ignoring the surface detail. So the box-like structure of the building or the tower is the important form first. And I try to arrange those in an eye-catching composition before I then go into the detail, then one can add as much or as little detail as one wants after that. And generally, I'll put more detail in the foreground and then suggest, just with almost an impressionistic touch, windows and doors and so on in the background. And what's really important there is the tonal relationship, the value relationship, I think you will call it, between the surface, the wall, and the apertures, the windows or doors, because a common thing to do is to make the window and door apertures far too dark in the distance.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. That seems to be the one thing that I do is, I don't know why, because, you're supposed to be painting what you see, but I think a lot of people do that. It's overly dark and maybe overly sharp, overly rendered.
Sure. I mean, it's not any different, I suppose, to painting landscape, in that we know there is aerial perspective where the values are different in the distance to the foreground. You have much more light and dark contrasting values in the foreground than in the distance. And that's very, very true of architecture. Also, that I like the idea, Eric, that you mentioned, that the softening of the distance pushes it far, far away. And that can work for buildings as well. Reduce the contrast between the values and just soften the effect. Work wet in wet if you're working in oils or watercolor for the distance, and bring the sharper, more clear forms into the foreground. And that gives you a really strong composition and a real feel for the environment.
Do you ever do any deconstructing? And what I mean by that is sometimes if I feel I want to push something back, I've already painted it. Maybe let's say it's a building and it's got the windows and everything on it, but I don't really want to draw all my attention to that particular building or that particular tree or object. Sometimes I'll just take the palette knife and scrape it over it, which makes the edges looser and makes the lines less prominent and the values kind of squished together a little bit, and it makes it read like it's going back. Do you ever do anything like that?
Sure. Yeah, all the time. Yeah, I mean, scraping back's wonderful. I recently completed a big painting of a place called Villa Adriana just outside Rome, which is a ruined Roman villa. And it almost became an archaeology in paint because I kept scraping back and putting back on. And it created this wonderful sort of blurry background. And it's only suggested with just a sharper form in the foreground. So, yeah, I agree. Just take some risks, really. Treat it like a landscape, but in cubes and triangles and blocks rather than organic forms of trees and fields and so forth. There is not really any difference in terms of the textural quality. You can do amazing things with oil paint like that, as you say, scrape it back and then just sharpen up the foreground. Wonderful things to do.
Talk to me about perspective. So many artists struggle with perspective. When I judge shows, the thing that pops out, probably one of the things that pop out the most, I think values or mistaken values tend to pop out a lot. But the other thing that pops out is incorrect perspective. You just see roof lines that look wrong, or just problems with perspective. How do you learn that? How do you get good at it? And especially when you're out plein air painting, you don't have the tools that you might have at home to try to figure that out. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on how we can improve our perspective?
Yeah, sure. It's one of those words that everyone turns white at the thought of, isn't it? Perspective. First of all, don't worry about it too much. I think that's the first thing, not to panic. There are, of course, the formalities of things like the viewpoint, the horizon, the point you're looking from. And a good rule of thumb is just to hold your pencil across horizontally in front of your eyes so you can work out what's above and below that point. And generally, any what's called orthogonals, the side of buildings which are going away from you, If they're above that line, they will drop down towards it in the center of the picture. If they're below that line, they will go up towards the center of the picture. So those are important things to remember. But you can get very wrapped up in the sort of geometry of that. The best thing to do is look and say, can I see the top of the roof on the building or not? Can I see, the side of the building? All of those things, it's a visual thing as well as a mathematical thing. And we get sort of stuck in between sometimes. So look at what's happening. If you're not sure whether an angle is going up or down on the side of a building going into the distance, hold the pencil up arm's length at its point, like the hands on a clock, and line up the pencil with the side of the roof or the bottom of the wall or whatever, and sort of think, what time on a clock is that pointing at? And that's a really helpful way to reproduce that angle on a page or a canvas, because you can think, oh yeah, that's 10 o'clock, that angle. And that's an easy one to remember. If you move your arm back to the canvas, by the time you've got there, you've forgotten what the angle is because your hand has moved with the pencil angle. So try and translate it into something you can remember, like the hands on a clock. And that way you can get this sort of recession and the way the perspective lines go off into the distance.
That's
the other thing I think.
That's one of the best tips I've ever heard. I've tried the pencil thing, but you're right. I try to transfer that line over to my canvas, and then I get it wrong. But what a great aha moment that's been. What's the other thing?
The other thing is to remember most vertical lines in a building are upright. And we do sometimes have a tendency to lean one way or the other. So just check your verticals. I suppose it depends what time in the day it is and how long you've been working, but just make sure those vertical lines are upright and centering. What's the pattern of doors and windows on that surface? And if it's a symmetrical building, I will always start in the center with the door and the windows up the building and then work outwards from there. Because if for any reason you haven't got enough room or you've made the building too wide, you'll be able to resolve that rather than have to do the whole lot again by starting in the middle. So I would always center the building with the windows and doors in the center of a facade before I work the outside ones.
So it's a measurement tool in a sense. Now, and do you find yourself, when you're doing your sketch or you're doing your initial lay-in, do you find yourself laying in perspective lines or your focal point, or your what's the term I'm looking for? The point at which your horizon line, point. And do you kind of lay those things in and your I'm not coming up with my terms.
But make a kind of structure.
Yeah.
I think you make a kind of structure. As I said earlier, I always sketch before I attack the canvas, so I've got some kind of graphic structure in my head that helps me each time I try and paint. And most of my big paintings, there's a full-size pencil drawing before I even make a mark on the canvas. But that idea of the eye line, the horizon, yes, get that in if it helps you. I don't tend to these days once I've drawn it, but I do make a point of marking what's called the vanishing point, the point you're opposite on the horizon, because that's where your perspective lines will sort of lead to from other parts of the painting. So that's always important to establish.
So do you put figures in your paintings?
Yes, I do. It's called Starfish here. I don't know what you call it in America. Anything that's not a building or a tree is called Starfish. So lots of little figures and cars and things. Most of my architectural work is aerial views, Eric. So I'm looking down into the cities from above. So they're like little ants walking along, or little high-vis builders and things. So they do put them. But they leave the eye that I use them to make a composition. Yeah.
So how do you do that? Do you go up in a tall building and make sketches, or do you have a drone and do photographs? What do you do?
No, I haven't got a drone. It might be quite fun, might it? No, I usually go up into tall buildings and make sketches on location, take photographs as well, and then combine the photography with the sketches, and my sketches are quite detailed, in a full-size drawing, as I mentioned. And this helps me organize absolutely everything apart from the color before I paint. So I find once I've concentrated on that scale drawing, for, it could take a week just to do the drawing, that has set the whole concept of the painting in my head already. So it makes the painting process much easier. I always say there's no pain, no gain with painting. That background, all the stuff that isn't to do with the painting itself, has to happen first. And learning perspective, just practicing drawing perspective is key to painting buildings.
So there's a term you're familiar with called foreshortening. How does that
foreshortening? Yeah.
How does that apply to architecture? Because if I'm looking up at a building, or an object on a building, let's say it's a balcony or something, isn't foreshortening involved in something like that?
Yes, that's right. If we talk about foreshortening in terms of the figure, it's where your arm is coming straight towards you, so you don't see the full length of the arm. You see the hand in front and the arm coming in a sort of squashed sense behind it towards the body. And the same thing applies to buildings, depending on where you're looking at them from, of course. So if you're looking from street level, the foreshortening is more to do with the side of the buildings going away from you, that kind of thing. If you're looking up at a building like a skyscraper, you'll notice that the two sides aren't parallel, but they start to converge together because of the height of the building, and that's foreshortening. And it's up to the artist to decide, do I paint a looking up view, say, of a skyscraper in New York with the sides converging, not to a point, but going narrower towards the top? Or do I make it look like an architectural drawing, which would be parallel sides going up a really long kind of column of a building? So foreshortening is important, but it's all dependent on your viewpoint.
So if you're trying to make something read well, though, are you trying to avoid that converging line where the two sides of the building are kind of, if you were to trace along those lines, they would eventually come to a point? Or are you trying to keep things looking straight? I know, for instance, in landscape painting, I oftentimes will see something that is kind of along the horizon that isn't straight. Let's say it's the shore of a river. And yet, when if it's slightly angled, it doesn't read right. So I just always make it look straight because it reads right. Is it similar to that in painting architecture? Certain things read better if you do certain things?
Kind of, Eric. I think, yes. The whole point is to decide which point of view you're looking at the buildings from. If you're looking sort of as if you're standing up straight ahead, then you won't see that sort of convergence of tall buildings because it won't read right. It will look like you've kind of had one too many and a bit wobbly, when you're looking at the picture. If you want a view of looking up at tall buildings, then you would use that converging line idea because that gives us a sense of being right underneath and looking upwards. But if we're looking straight ahead, then the verticals, as I mentioned earlier, will be vertical because your eye line isn't changing. And the thing with architecture is as soon as you move your head to look at the top of the building or the side of the building, the perspective is changing at that moment.
Right.
And as a painter of architecture, you have to compensate for that to make it look right, as you're saying with your river in your landscape. It's the same with buildings. You have to remember whether you're looking from one point of view or two. And most architectural painters use several viewpoints. They're not just one central viewpoint. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the Italian 18th century view painter Canaletto, who worked in Venice. He moves things around and changes the viewpoints several times in one picture, but it all reads correctly. So there's an artistic decision to make there as well as an observational one.
Oh, Canaletto is probably historically one of the most important architecture painters of all time, yeah?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, he more or less invents the cityscape as we know it now. And what a draftsman. A great inspiration.
So I'd like to kind of move into this idea of art history and get a feel for some of the things that you talk about when you do lectures about the history of architecture and painting. Where is it rooted? Is it rooted in Canaletto, or is it Constable, or where does it come from?
Where does it come from? Well, as a genre, as a style, a subject of painting, it's quite a recent one. It emerges just before Canaletto. The Dutch people like Vermeer, of course, are painting street scenes and cityscapes in Holland in the 17th century. Prior to that, it's not used as the subject of a painting. It's just used as a background or a context. But from the 17th century in Europe, the subject matter can become a street scene or a house or something like that. Canaletto takes that idea in the following century in Venice and paints views of the city. And one of the wonderful quotes about Canaletto is given by an agent to a collector who was trying to get a view of the city. And he said, "You want to get a painting from Canaletto because his buildings are so real and it looks like the sun is shining on them." And so what Canaletto manages to achieve for the first time really is a totality of the city. It all hangs together really well in one sense of dramatic light, everyday light, and all the perspective worked together. And the interesting thing about Canaletto, before he was a view painter, he was a set designer for the theatre, where perspective was essential to create an illusion on stage of a scene. And so his training is really as a scene painter for the opera, and then he transfers that onto canvas and becomes, a celebrity. Comes over to London for 10 years, for example, and paints London.
I was telling my wife a story about Canaletto the other day, which we were in Palm Beach on vacation, and we drove by the Flagler Mansion, and I said to my wife, "Do you remember when we rented the Flagler Mansion? We had this giant party for these art dealers that were at the big art show there." And she said, "Yeah, I remember that." I said, "Did I ever tell you the Canaletto story?" And she said, "What's a Canaletto? Is it a melon?" and I think it was, I probably won't say the name because I might get it wrong. But so one of the dealers from London was wandering through the building, and they had a fabulous art collection that Henry Flagler had, that it was behind a velvet rope. And we had the whole place to ourselves. We had rented it. And he went inside the rope and looked at this painting, and it on the the tag identifying the painting, it said artist unknown. And he discovered that it was a lost Canaletto. And
amazing.
And so it was quite a feat getting the museum to cooperate with him to get it certified and so on. But ultimately, it turned out to be a Canaletto that had not been seen or known about for 100 years.
Wow, what a discovery.
Yeah. So
that's so exciting, isn't it, to think they're out there still?
Yeah. So what's the artist that, if you could find it in a garage sale, any artist in the world, which artist would you wish to find?
Oh my goodness. Well, do you know, at the moment I'm just looking at Florentine Renaissance paintings for Easter, sort of an Easter themed series I've been doing. And I've come across one who I've always loved, but I'm falling in love with again, and that's Pontormo, who's a very strange artist working at in the middle of the 16th century in Florence, because his colours are so strange. Figurative work, mostly religious paintings, but strange, very strange, almost surreal in a modern sense painting. So I think a lost Pontormo would be great fun.
Well, we're all hoping for that day, right? When we pick something up and we go, "Gee, this kind of looks nice," and then,
we found it. But art history is full of these missing masterpieces. You know, some we don't know where they've gone. There was a famous Caravaggio thinking about Easter stories of the resurrection of Christ, and it's never been found. No one knows what happened to it. So you never know, Eric. It might be in your yard sale one day, and you'll discover a lost Caravaggio.
Well, there are a lot of theories that a lot of stolen paintings are hanging in private homes. Sometimes they know they're stolen, and sometimes they don't. But every once in a while, something comes and sees the light of day, and hopefully we'll see more and more of that. As the internet, the Art Lost Register has played a major role. I think it's there in London, has played a major role in finding a lot of things because people pick things up. Maybe somebody died, they had a stolen painting and they knew it and their kids didn't know it, and they sell it in a garage sale or in an art auction. And, those things come to light, from time to time. So,
and there it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly,
yes, certainly
there's Lost Vermeer, at least one. And, that was from the museum, the Gardner Museum in Boston, which had 13 paintings stolen.
Mm-hmm. They haven't found any of them, have they?
I think I may be wrong, but I think one of them recently was found.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. Good.
Yeah.
There's a Rembrandt as well going missing. But no, it's amazing, isn't it, how art sort of is a universal currency almost in those spheres, and people are desperate to have a Vermeer or a Monet in some circles, and will do anything to get one. Interestingly, in Canaletto's time, when he came to London, he had to put an advertisement in the newspaper to say, Canaletto is in London, come and see me work in my studio, because there were so many fake Canalettos in London at the time, no one believed it was really him, and the only way he could prove it was for people to come and see him painting. So it's been around for a while, all these sort of mysteries in the art world.
So if he was so good, which he was, how is it that people were able to knock off his work so well? You said there were a lot of fakes.
They weren't that good.
Oh, they weren't? No.
A lot of them. But you have to remember, most people wouldn't know what a Canaletto looks like. Right. They've just heard him by reputation, or would have seen him through black and white engraving, that they were only seen in big collections in private houses. So, the man on the corner of the street comes, oi, mate, I've got a Canaletto here. It's only 200 quid. And you'd think you'd got a real one because you wouldn't know the difference.
So
we're very lucky now, aren't we? You can see things.
Do you think Canaletto did any plein air painting?
Yes, he did, often. There's some, certainly he sketched on location, and he makes a big thing of actually painting out in Venice or in London to capture the exact sense of light and shade of that particular moment. We associate that with the Impressionists much more, but he does it in Venice, and he used to cart a canvas half finished into St. Mark's Square in Venice when he knew important people were coming round, and finish it off in front of them, and then say, I've just finished this for you, sir, and then they'd be too embarrassed not to buy it. So it's quite a good marketing tool, that as well.
I'm going to use that technique from now. So he painted them in advance on location, then brought them back and finished them, or did he paint them in the studio?
A bit of each, yes. He had a big studio with his family working with him. His nephew, we call Bellotto, or sometimes known as Canaletto, is almost indistinguishable from Canaletto's work. So it was a family business because he was in such demand, he had to produce a lot of work. And often you can tell, if you're familiar with looking at lots of Canalettos, which bits aren't quite as sort of stylistically right as others. But this idea of working on location to capture the effects of light, particularly on buildings, is, I think, almost unique at the time. Some bigger works, of course, would be done in the studio from sketches, but he was so familiar with the city, I think he could almost paint it from memory by the time he was at his full power.
And was he Italian?
He was Italian. He was from Venice itself.
But he ended up in London. Did he end up living there and staying there?
He came to London. He made his name in Venice and came to London to try and find a new audience, because a lot of the people who came to Venice were rich people from London. So he came to London to sort of extend his market, if you like, as we all have to do at some point. And he stayed in London for about 10 years and then went back to Venice. So, yes, he's here for quite a long time. He does some incredible views of 18th century London.
So who were some of the other
shop signs?
Who were some of the other prominent historical architectural painters, especially the plein air ones? I'm interested in that.
The plein air painters. So you had something around this time in the 18th century and onwards into the 19th century called the Grand Tour, and a lot of English, French, and German artists would go to Italy to paint and sketch on location. So we have people like Turner going over to Italy and making mostly watercolors there, but a wonderful sketchbook of watercolors, lots and lots of those. Another artist called John Robert Cousins, his contemporary with Turner's period, works on location. Then we come into later the Impressionists at the end of the 19th century, people like Monet, suddenly discovers architecture when he's painting his series of Rouen Cathedral, which I can't remember how many canvases there are. There's dozens of canvases. Of the front of Rouen Cathedral at different times of day, in different weathers and in different lights. And he had a room opposite from which he would paint for an hour on one canvas and then swap to the next one to capture the next light effects and so on. And that triggered him to paint architecture a lot more, I think, because he comes to London and he paints the Houses of Parliament in the fog, and they're extraordinary paintings, if you've ever seen those, Eric. I mean, I think there's several in different collections across the States and in Europe, but just this sort of intricate, almost abstract weaving of patches of colour, which read further back as the bits of London sort of appearing out of the fog. And Monet was really interested in that, because London weather, as you probably know if you've been here, changes every 10 minutes. And he found the fog fascinating because it never stood still. The colours, the light were changing all the time, which is exactly the problems we're forced with in painting on plein air, isn't it? That everything changes every second. And so Monet was really interested in that, not just in architecture, but in landscape as well, as you know. But his paintings of architecture are extraordinary. And then you come into Winslow Homer and Hopper in the States, working in wonderful, evocative paintings of architecture in America, and onwards from there, really. It just goes on and on.
So what's the state of plein air painting in the UK? You have weather issues in London. You've got a lot of rain. You have relatively short summer season. How many people are out there doing it? It's interesting to me because there was a term called Sunday painters, and that term comes from my understanding of this, and I probably have it wrong, but my understanding is that the Sunday painter were the hobbyists who were doing mostly watercolor. And it was kind of a weekend thing to go out to a beautiful park and with your family and your parasol and your beautiful white dress, and you would sit there and do watercolor paintings. And it became, from my understanding, a national pastime, which is something I'd like to see happen here. But is there a fairly significant plein air movement in the UK like there is here in America?
There is there's several sort of organisations and movements to work out of doors here, not quite in the same way as you have your plein air conventions and things like that. The tradition, as you're quite right, is an amateur one mostly, that it was a leisure occupation. Queen Victoria set the trend because she was a pretty good watercolorist, actually. But if the Queen did it, then all the ladies in waiting did it, and so on. So it sort of filters down from that level. But also, I think there is this interest in recording the environment here with Turner onwards, working out of doors. And one of the ways artists could make money was to take people out sketching and they pay them for lessons. So that idea of the Sunday painter is a sort of amateur, semi-professional idea that you only have time at the weekend to paint. The weather is a problem, but many artists just ignore it and get on with it. So there are movements and little sort of subgroups of people working out of doors. And then we have things called the Urban Sketchers Association, which started here in the UK, but I think it's now international.
Well, it's massive.
Where it just suddenly grew, and that's very much an architectural group of people working together out of doors once a month or every day. They post things on their sites and things like that in Facebook. So you can find ways to work out of doors on PleinAir, depending on how you want to work. And then as an individual, your choice is to work outdoors or indoors. I do a bit of each, really. I work in the studio and out of doors, and trying to run out when it's sunny if I can, and get some good light. Because with architecture, I think you do need strong sunlight to get the definition of the buildings and the shadows on structures. So yes, there is a tradition here, and I think it's growing quite a lot now. And in the last year, particularly when we have been allowed out, because we're not allowed out at the moment, people have discovered that the arts is really good for their well-being. They get absorbed in the arts and they want to work out of doors and create wonderful paintings. So it's a really transforming time, I think, for plein air painting at the moment here.
So you can't even go out to a park where you're out in the open air and you're by yourself. You have to stay indoors right now?
We're not supposed to go. We're only supposed to go out for 1 hour exercise a day, and we can only go to the shops for provisions or medicines. That's it. If you can work from home, you're supposed to stay in. So it's been pretty tough for several months at different times last year, and now we're just coming out of another batch of that. So yeah, it's a real serious lockdown across the whole country. It's not just regional. So, but I know artists do sneak out, and I see on Facebook my friends have been out painting for the day, rather naughtily, but yeah, good for them. I think I've been too busy on Zoom teaching to get out much, but I'm looking forward to this summer. I'm looking forward to this summer when I can. So yes, that'd be good.
Tell me about your teaching on Zoom. What are you teaching? Because I'm sure people here would be interested in that.
Oh, well, thank you, Eric. Yeah, because I usually teach live classes during the week, everything was transferred to virtual on Zoom, which has been a revelation, really, because you can record it, you can close up on what you're painting, with the camera, so people can see the brushwork even. And so what I've done every week is set up a very informal, any level kind of attendance painting groups. One for drawing, one for watercolors, one for oil painting. And then I also do some online art history lectures once a week, just half an hour on a Monday, looking at one painting a week, which has been really popular. So I'm very, very privileged to have the support for that. It's been very, very much appreciated, and everyone seems to enjoy it. And, we have quite a laugh sometimes about all of these things, and we work together, which builds a sense of community anyway. So it's nice that people come from all over the country to join in.
Oh, we have an audience of 128 or 150 countries, something like that. So where can they find out more about you, about your artwork, about your Zoom training, etc.?
Sure. You can look up my website. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Everything's on there, which is jameswillisart.co.uk. And if anyone wants just a little sample of some art history lectures, I set up a few months ago a free site with a few little 5-minute lectures on for people who are stressed at home and just need a 5-minute break from work, or caring for people, or people who are nurses and doctors are working really hard. Just little 5-minute sort of snapshot talks that will inspire via a visual art image, and that's called artofminds.co.uk, because we're in the UK, of course. So Art of Minds, and that's a free thing. You can just log in and watch a little download. of art history.
Is that
Change
art,
your way of
A-R-T,
thinking for the best.
art of mind
Art
or out
of
of mind?
Mind, art of
Art
mind.
of mind.co.uk.
Yeah, minds with an S on.
Minds. All right. Excellent. Well, James, This has been fascinating. It's been fun learning about painting architecture and the history of architecture. And I'm sure there's so much more we could get, but we've kind of run out of time here. So I really want to thank you. And I want to extend an invitation to you once things are freed up. And when you're ready to do it, we'll have you back to the PleinAir convention, and or we'll have you on one of our virtual conferences or something. But and hopefully I'll get over there, or you'll get over here one of these days soon, and we'll go paint some buildings together.
We'll do it, Eric. That'll be fantastic. It was lovely to talk to you, and thank you for inviting me to share some of my experience with you. I hope that's been interesting for people. And keep safe and well, please, and look forward to when we can meet up again.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, Eric.
Well, thanks again to James Willis. He's been a great friend, an all-around nice man, an incredible teacher, a great painter, very inspirational. Be sure to visit his website to check out his work and his book and his Zoom workshops. And if you get to, if you can own one of his pieces, I mean, he's a really big deal, and it would be nice to have that. So thank you to James. Are you guys ready for a little bit of some art marketing ideas?
This is the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhoads, author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, Make More Money Selling Your Art. Proven techniques to turn your passion into profit.
Well, thanks again, Jim. In the Art Marketing Minute, I try, sometimes, I always answer your questions. Whether or not I do a good job, that's another story, but I try to answer your questions. You can email your questions, eric@artmarketing.com. I love questions. And what I do is I just kind of read these as we go, and I make up the answers off the top of my head. I don't have any prepared answers because I think I work best that way. This is coming from Derek Jones in Syracuse, New York, who says, I'm new to painting outdoors. I'm very shy. When people come up and watch while I'm trying to paint, I get nervous because I don't feel like my work is good enough for others to see yet. How do you overcome that? Well, that is a huge topic, Derek. First off, it's a self-esteem thing, right? We don't feel worthy because, we maybe are not painting as well as Clyde Aspavig, the great Clyde Aspavig, or maybe not even as well as some of our friends. But every painter goes through that. That is a process. And we all have to knock out a lot of bad paintings before we start knocking out some good paintings. And even those who have been doing it a lot of years will still knock out bad paintings from time to time. And by the way, there's not a bad painting because every painting is a lesson. So here's how I dealt with that particular issue. First off, when I first started painting, I just kind of went and painted places where there were not people because I just didn't want to be around people who were critical. The next thing I did is as I was painting around people, I took some earbuds, some iPod earbuds or whatever, and I stuck them in my pocket, put them in my ear, stuck it in my pocket as if there was a player in there. And surprisingly, not very many people would bother me when I'm doing that. But, there's always going to be somebody somebody's going to come up and talk to you about it. And I used to make excuses. I remember I was painting Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and I was on the corner, and this is before it burned down, and there were a bunch of teenagers, and they were all gathered around watching me. There were 10 or 12 of them. They were all speaking French and laughing and making fun of me and stuff. It was a little uncomfortable, but they were nice kids. They weren't going to beat me or anything. And one of the kids came up and said in English, he said, you should give up painting. You're not very good. And I said, well, thank you for that encouragement, but I'm doing what I call a study. I will take this information and then I'll go and do a more in-depth painting at home. And, I just, what can you say? I mean, some people aren't going to like it. Some people are going to be critical. Sometimes I would say, well, I'm just getting started, come back in a couple hours and see how I do. But, you just have to live for yourself. You can't live about how others think. And so I will tell you this, that your self-talk makes a huge difference. If you constantly are telling yourself you're not doing a good job, guess what will happen? You won't be doing a good job. If you constantly tell yourself you're doing a good job, you're learning, you're growing, you don't care what happens, you just are going to make it the best you feel you can make it today. You know, I'm looking around my studio here. I have dozens and dozens of paintings on the walls, and there's studies that I've done, and each one is a memory. Some of them are good paintings and some of them are not so good paintings, but each one is a memory. Each one gave me a lesson. And so there was value in every single one of them. So just embrace it for what it is. It's not really a big deal. So you're not unlike others. The best way to overcome it, though, I'll tell you that I had a guy by the name of Michael Ringer. He's a great artist, a great watercolor artist, but does many other mediums as well. He came to visit me, and I'm kind of walking him through the house, and every time we'd encounter a painting, he'd ask about it, and I would make some excuse. And then we went for a boat ride, and then he came back, and I took him to his car. And before he got in his car, he said, "Eric, I want to talk to you about something." Yeah, I said, "Yes." And he said, "Listen, you did a lot of apologizing for your work. You don't need to apologize. You're a good painter. You have a lot of potential. And yes, there's some growth that you need to go through." He said, "But you're doing better than I was at this stage of your career." He said, "Just quit complaining about it and quit apologizing, and it's going to impact your head." And, when the fact that he cared enough to stand out and say something like that really meant it. And so I've been very careful to try and stop making excuses and just let it be what it's going to be. But if you want to avoid the crowds in the beginning, I understand that. There are people who have said to me, "Well, I don't want to come to the PleinAir convention because I'm not good enough." But, everybody there has been through it. Everybody there has made bad paintings, including many, many of us, all of us, actually. And so, we understand that. You're with family there. You're not with consumers who are going to give you a hard time. You're with people who are going to give you love and say, "Hey, you're okay. You're doing a great job. And, just tweak this, do this, put a little more dark in the foreground or bigger shapes or something." A lot of those things will make a big difference. Here's the next question. It comes from Hunter Smith in Los Angeles, California. Hunter says, "Looking back and forward, do you think there's anything we can take away from the pandemic in regards to making a living as an artist?" Oh, man, tough question. Hunter, I think that the pandemic is the best thing to ever happen to me. And thankfully, I've lived through it so far, and hopefully will continue to. But I think the idea here is that I learned a lot about myself. I learned about my priorities, what I want to do, what I don't want to do, what I want to spend my time on. I want to spend more time with my family. I actually have enjoyed the time at home. I've been working harder. But I had to kind of, rebound and come up with some new ways to make a living, like my 12 noon daily show on Facebook and YouTube. And so I think that a lot of artists have said, this has been really good for them because they've gotten off the circuit, off the merry-go-round, and they're not traveling around as much, and they're focusing on their painting. And so a lot of them have said, I learned a lot as a painter. I grew a lot as a painter because I was painting more. I was painting uninterrupted. I wasn't tempted to, get in the car and go get stimulation by, going and getting, some shopping or something in. And so I think, from that standpoint, we're all better. I think in terms of making a living as an artist, first off, a lot of artists are telling me they're selling more art than ever because other people are starting to appreciate art more and also look at their walls and say, "Hey, I need something there." I think in terms of making money as an artist, what you've got to do, and maybe what the pandemic will do for you, is it will set your priorities. Ask yourself, what am I willing to do? What am I not willing to do? Am I painting for myself? Am I painting for others? Am I doing both? Am I in a position to kind of focus on what I want to do? Life's too short. I had friends pass away. You probably did too. And life's too short. Suddenly people who thought they were going to be around forever are not going to be around forever. And so ask yourself, if I always do this in my seminars. I did this way before the pandemic. I do this on my videos and stuff. And ask yourself, if you only had, you went to the doctor and you only had 1 year left, what would you do with that 1 year? Because that'll help you crystallize your thinking. And then the other thing I do in my book and some other things, I ask you to write your own obituary and write what you've done, and then write what you want to get done as if you've done it. And then that'll help you crystallize what it is you really need to do. It might be about selling paintings. It might be about giving away paintings. It might be about getting recognition. You have to determine, what is it that's important to you? Is it a living you need to make? Is it recognition you need? Is it helping others you want to do? So I think in those terms, and then now that you've crystallized your thinking, then you have to say, okay, how do I get there? And whatever it is you decide, how do I get there? Everything starts with a goal, and then a goal leads to a plan. A goal sets your strategy, and then a plan sets your tactics. A strategy is the overarching thing that you're trying to accomplish. The tactics are how you accomplish them. Tactics are things like advertising or social media or doing shows, etc. And then you have to ask yourself, how busy do I want to be? How much money do I need to make? If you start with the questions, you always come up with the answers. And you got to spend a lot of time thinking, but thinking is where all the answers come from, right? It's just don't do it routinely. I sometimes will spend 10, 12, 15 hours thinking about a particular topic. When I went on vacation, I had 60 pages of notes of my thinking. I read 4 books, 3 or 4 books, and I took one online course in a particular area of marketing that I wanted to learn more about. And then my thinking really started happening as a result of that. So I think that you've got to just kind of figure out where you want to go and then how to get there. I mean, that's the bottom line.
This has been the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhoads. You can learn more at artmarketing.com.
Well, we've got so much going on. We got the PleinAir Live coming up. You want to get your seats pretty soon before you have to pay a higher price. It's 100% guaranteed, by the way. And that means that if you watch the first day, you don't feel like the first day was worth the entire price, let us know by the end of the first day. We'll refund your money. How easy is that? So check that out. Check out soarworkshops.com to check out the Thomas Schaller. Check out publishersinvitational.com to see my Adirondack event and to learn more about that this summer. I think that'd be a lot of fun. And if you've not seen my blog where I talk about life and art and all kinds of things like that, check that out. It's called Sunday Coffee. You can find it at coffeewitheric.com. Well, this has been fun. It's been fun having a vacation and getting away, and I appreciate you being patient. Somebody sent me a note the other day. They said, I listen to you while I'm lying in bed going to sleep. Yes, I have that effect on people. What can I say? Well, this has been fun. We'll do it again sometime, like next week, and I'll see you then. I'm Eric Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine, and you can find us online at outdoorpainter.com. Remember, it's a big world out there. Go paint it. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
This has been the PleinAir Podcast with PleinAir Magazine's Eric Rhoads. You can help spread the word about plein air painting by sharing this podcast with your friends. And you can leave a review or subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you every week. And you can even reach Eric by email, eric@pleinairmagazine.com. Be sure to pick up our free ebook, 240 plein air painting tips by some of America's top painters. It's free at pleinairtips.com. Tune in next week for more great interviews. Thanks for listening.